There are places in this world that don't behave the way history says they should. Massive stones cut with impossible precision, structures buried as if they were meant to be forgotten, patterns carved into rock that look planned but never explained. Across deserts, mountains, and silent valleys, we keep finding evidence of something we don't fully understand. In this video, we're exploring a series of ancient sites that challenge everything we think we know about early civilizations, from unfinished monuments too large to move, to hidden grids beneath the earth, to structures that feel designed but don't tell us why. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? And if you enjoy these kinds of deep, quiet discoveries, make sure to subscribe, because what you're about to see isn't just history. So take a moment, settle in. The hexagonal halls hidden beneath the ground, Sardinia. Beneath a landscape that appears ordinary at the surface, there are spaces that were never meant to be seen from above. No walls rising into the sky, no structures marking their presence from a distance, just ground, quiet, unbroken. But below it, the shape changes. Stone corridors, chambers, and a pattern that repeats in a way that doesn't feel accidental. This is the hidden structure beneath Sardinia, and what makes it stand out is not just that it exists underground, but how it is formed, because the spaces are arranged in a hexagonal pattern, creating a geometry that feels deliberate, controlled, and consistent across the structure. And that changes how the site is understood. The halls are carved into stone, not built upward, not assembled from separate pieces, but shaped from within the ground, creating spaces that exist beneath the surface rather than above it. And that method reflects a different approach, because it removes instead of adding. The hexagonal layout defines the structure. Six-sided forms repeating across the space, creating chambers that connect in a pattern, forming a system that extends beyond a single room. And that pattern matters, because it shows that the design follows a rule. The walls of these chambers are solid, continuous stone surfaces that define the boundaries of each space, creating interiors that feel contained and stable. And that stability reflects understanding, because it shows that the structure relies on the integrity of the material. The connections between chambers are narrow, openings that link one space to another, guiding movement through the structure in a controlled way. And that flow adds meaning, because it shapes how the space is experienced. The ceiling follows the same geometry, angled surfaces meeting at edges, forming a structure that maintains the hexagonal form throughout, indicating that the design was consistent across all dimensions, and that consistency reflects planning. Because it shows that the structure was intentional. The effort required to create such halls would have been significant. Stone removed gradually, shapes defined carefully. A process that requires precision, because the geometry must be maintained across the entire structure. And that effort reflects control, because it shows that the design was followed. The underground placement creates isolation, because the structure exists beneath the surface, separated from the environment above, forming a space that is enclosed not just by walls, but by the earth itself. And that isolation adds depth, because it changes perception. The absence of natural light creates a different experience, because the structure is not shaped by sunlight but by its own form, making the geometry more prominent than the surroundings, and that emphasis highlights the design. The purpose of these halls is not fully defined, because while the structure is clear, the exact reason for creating such a geometric underground system remains uncertain, and that uncertainty adds mystery, because it leaves questions unanswered. The precision of the hexagonal layout suggests knowledge, because maintaining consistent angles and proportions across multiple chambers requires understanding of form, and that precision reflects intention, because it shows that the structure was planned. The relationship between the chambers suggests connection, because the repeated pattern creates a network rather than isolated spaces, forming a system that extends beyond a single point, and that network adds complexity, because it shows that the structure is more than one room. Even now, much of the structure remains hidden, because what is visible is only part of what exists, with sections that may extend further beneath the surface, and that hidden aspect adds depth, because it expands the structure beyond what can be seen. The contrast between the surface and the underground space defines the site, because above, the land appears simple, Below, the structure is complex, and that difference creates impact, because it shows how much can exist without being visible. What defines these halls is geometry, not height, not decoration, but form. A pattern repeated across stone, a structure shaped by angles and connections, a system that exists beneath the ground, and that combination creates something different, because it is not built to be seen. It is built to exist, hidden, structured, deliberate. And maybe that is what makes these hexagonal halls stand out, not just because they are underground, but because of how they are shaped, a structure that follows a pattern so consistent that it feels intentional, even without a clear explanation. Stone carved into form, chambers connected in sequence, a geometry that repeats in silence, and that pattern, the stone forms that resemble thrones preserved by time, Tacti Solomon, in a landscape shaped by both water and stone, where the ground carries layers of mineral deposits and the terrain reflects long-term transformation. There are forms that stand out not because they rise high, but because of how they are shaped. At first they appear irregular, stone surfaces, layered textures, edges that feel natural, but then the shapes begin to settle into something more recognizable. Raised platforms, curved edges, forms that resemble seating. And that's where the distinction begins. This is Tacti Solomon. And what makes it stand out is not just the presence of stone formations, but how these structures resemble thrones, because their shapes suggest function, even though they were formed through processes that are not fully understood in terms of intent. And that changes how the site is interpreted. The formations are solid, composed of mineral-rich stone that has hardened over time, creating surfaces that are both smooth in places and textured in others. And that composition matters, because it defines the structure. The shapes resemble seats, raised bases, back-like forms, curved surfaces that suggest a place to sit, even though their origin is not clearly tied to deliberate carving, and that resemblance adds meaning, because it influences perception. The process that formed these structures involves mineral deposition, layers building gradually, creating shapes that grow over time rather than being carved all at once. And that process reflects transformation, because it shows how form can emerge. The positioning of these formations within the site creates a layout, not random, but grouped in ways that suggest placement, even if that placement is influenced by natural conditions, and that arrangement adds structure, because it shows that the forms are connected. The surface of the stone reflects change, smooth in some areas, rough in others, indicating that different parts of the formation developed under different conditions. And that variation adds depth, because it shows complexity. The presence of water in the region has influenced the formation of these structures, because mineral-rich water deposits material over time, gradually shaping the stone into defined forms, and that interaction matters, because it connects environment and structure. The scale of the formations is moderate, large enough to be noticeable, but not overwhelming, creating a presence that is defined by shape rather than size. And that balance shapes perception, because it draws attention to form. The resemblance to thrones is not exact, but suggestive, creating a connection between the natural formation and the idea of seating, even if the original process was not intended to produce that function. And that ambiguity adds mystery, because it blurs interpretation. The effort involved is not in carving, but in time, because the formations developed gradually, shaped by environmental conditions rather than immediate construction. And that timescale adds another layer, because it reflects duration. The purpose of these formations is not fully defined, because while their shape suggests possible use, there is no clear confirmation of how they were intended to function. And that uncertainty adds depth, because it leaves questions open. The relationship between the formations and the surrounding site creates context, because they exist within a landscape that includes both natural and constructed elements, making it difficult to separate what is formed and what is built. And that overlap adds complexity, because it merges categories. The preservation of these structures allows them to remain visible, because the mineral composition resists erosion, maintaining the shape despite environmental exposure. And that durability keeps them present. Even now the formations remain, their shapes still intact, their surfaces still reflecting the processes that created them, allowing them to be observed as both objects and results of change. and that persistence keeps them relevant. What defines these formations is transformation, not carved, not assembled, but formed. A structure shaped over time, a surface built layer by layer, a design that emerges rather than being imposed, and that creates something different, because it exists between categories, not fully natural, not fully constructed. Forms that resemble function, structures that suggest purpose, a shape that invites interpretation. And maybe that is what makes the petrified thrones of Tacti Solomon stand out. Not just because of how they look, but because of how they formed, a process that creates structure without direct construction, producing shapes that feel intentional even when they may not be. Stone shaped by time, surfaces built in layers, forms that resemble seats, and that transformation. The stone surface that looks like a map but explains nothing. Sakafuna Ishi. On a quiet stretch of ground where the surrounding landscape feels simple and unchanged, there is a single stone that holds more detail than everything around it. At first, it doesn't seem unusual, a large block, resting in place, part of the terrain, but then the surface begins to reveal something else. Lines, grooves, channels cut into the stone in a way that does not feel random. And the longer you look, the more it starts to resemble something familiar. A pattern, a layout, almost like a map. This is Sakafuna Ishi, and what makes it stand out is not its size but its surface, because the carvings etched into this stone create a network of lines and depressions that appear structured, yet do not match any single clear function. And that changes how the object is understood. The stone itself is large, stable, positioned in a way that suggests it has remained in place for a long time, forming a fixed reference point within the landscape, and that stability matters, because it anchors the structure. The carvings are deliberate, cut into the surface with controlled depth, creating channels that vary in width and direction, forming a pattern that is too organised to be accidental, and that precision reflects intention, because it shows that the design was planned. Some grooves are straight, others curve, intersecting at points that suggest connection, creating a network that extends across the surface rather than isolated markings, and that connectivity adds complexity, because it shows that the carvings are related. The depth of the channels varies, some shallow, others deeper, indicating that different parts of the design may have served different roles within the overall pattern, and that variation adds another layer, because it suggests hierarchy. The surface of the stone interacts with the carvings, flat areas contrasting with cut sections, creating a difference between what was left untouched and what was altered, and that contrast adds clarity, because it highlights the design. The arrangement of the grooves suggests flow, lines that guide movement across the surface, creating paths that connect one area to another, and that flow matters, because it implies direction. The effort required to carve such patterns into stone would have been significant. Material removed carefully, edges maintained, a process that requires both time and control to preserve the intended layout, and that effort reflects planning, because it shows that the structure was deliberate. The interpretation of these carvings remains uncertain, because while they resemble a map, there is no clear confirmation of what they represent, leaving the design open to multiple possibilities, and that uncertainty adds depth, because it expands meaning. The scale of the pattern is contained, not extending across a landscape, but concentrated within a single surface, creating a compact system that holds complexity within limited space. And that concentration matters, because it focuses attention. The relationship between the grooves suggests measurement, spacing that appears intentional, distances that repeat in ways that indicate order rather than randomness. And that order reflects design, because it shows that the pattern follows a rule. Some sections of the stone appear more worn than others, indicating that parts of the surface may have been used more frequently or exposed differently over time. And that wear adds another layer, because it reflects interaction. The purpose of the stone remains undefined, because while its carvings are clear, the function they served is not fully preserved within the record. And that lack of clarity adds mystery, because it leaves the system incomplete. The presence of intersecting channels suggests more than decoration, because the layout implies movement or transfer, indicating that the design may have been functional rather than purely symbolic, and that implication adds complexity, because it suggests use. The durability of the stone ensures that the carvings remain visible. Even after long periods of exposure, the lines continue to define the surface, preserving the pattern. And that persistence keeps it relevant. The interpretation of the structure depends on perspective, because from one view it appears abstract, from another it begins to resemble a system. And that shift matters, because it changes understanding. The contained nature of the design creates a sense of focus, because everything exists within a single surface, forming a complete system that does not extend beyond its boundaries. And that containment adds impact, because it concentrates detail. Even now, Sakafuna Ishi remains, its carvings still visible, its pattern still intact, allowing the structure to be observed even without full explanation. And that presence keeps it alive. What defines this structure is ambiguity, not absence of design, but absence of explanation, a pattern that feels intentional, a surface that suggests purpose, a system that remains incomplete, and that creates something different, because it invites interpretation, lines forming paths, channels suggesting flow, a structure that resembles something familiar, but does not confirm it. And maybe that is what makes Sakafuna Ishi stand out, not just because of what is carved, but because of what it suggests, a design that feels like a map without a key, a system that appears organized but does not reveal its function, stone shaped into pattern, lines crossing in silence, a structure that holds meaning without giving it away, and that mystery. The massive obelisk that was almost freed from stone, Aswan. In a quarry where the ground itself has been shaped by extraction, there is a form that remains suspended between creation and completion. Not fully part of the rock, not fully separate from it. A structure that was meant to rise, but never left the ground. At first, the site feels like any other quarry. Cut surfaces, broken stone, marks of removal. But then, the scale shifts. A single form begins to dominate the space. Long, defined, carved directly into the bedrock. This is the unfinished obelisk of Aswan, and what makes it stand out is not just its size, but the fact that it was carved in place and left behind, because this is not a fallen structure. It is one that was never fully released, and that changes how the site is understood. The obelisk is cut from a single mass of stone, not assembled, not joined, but shaped directly from the bedrock, creating a form that is continuous with the ground beneath it. And that method matters, because it shows origin. The length of the obelisk is immense, extending across the quarry floor, creating a structure that feels disproportionate to human scale, and that scale defines the site, because it becomes the focus. The surfaces of the obelisk are smoothed, shaped along straight lines that define its form, indicating that the process of refinement had progressed significantly before it was abandoned, and that shaping reflects precision, because it shows that the design was controlled. The sides of the obelisk are partially separated from the surrounding rock, channels cut along its edges to isolate the structure, leaving only sections still attached beneath. And that partial separation matters, because it shows that the process was nearly complete. The effort required to carve such a structure would have been enormous. Stone removed gradually, tools applied repeatedly to shape the surface and create the channels needed for release. And that effort reflects coordination, because it shows that the work was organised. The reason for abandonment is linked to a flaw, a crack within the stone that compromised the integrity of the structure, making it unsuitable for its intended purpose. And that flaw changes everything, because it stops the process. The presence of this crack reveals the limits of material, because even with careful shaping, the internal structure of the stone determines what is possible. And that limitation adds depth, because it shows constraint. The quarry itself provides context, a place where stone was regularly extracted, indicating that the techniques used were known and practiced. And that context adds meaning, because it shows that this was not an isolated attempt. The unfinished state of the obelisk preserves the process, because the marks of carving remain visible, showing how the stone was shaped step by step, and that visibility keeps it relevant. The scale of the intended structure suggests purpose, an object meant to stand vertically, removed from the quarry and placed elsewhere, indicating that the obelisk was part of a larger system, and that intention adds complexity, because it connects the object to a broader design. The contrast between intention and outcome defines the site, because the obelisk was meant to be completed but remains unfinished, creating a structure that represents both effort and interruption. And that contrast adds impact, because it highlights difference. The relationship between the obelisk and the surrounding rock is still visible, because the structure remains partially embedded, showing exactly where it was cut and how it was meant to be freed. And that clarity adds understanding, because it reveals process. Even now the obelisk remains, carved, defined, but still attached to the ground, allowing it to be observed as a structure that never completed its transformation, and that presence keeps it alive. What defines this obelisk is incompletion, not absence of design, but interruption. A structure that was nearly finished, a form that was ready to be moved, a process that stopped at the final stage, and that creates something different. Because it is not a finished monument, it is a moment frozen in time, a plan halted, a structure that never reached its intended place. And maybe that is what makes the unfinished obelisk of Aswan stand out. Not just because of its size, but because of what it reveals, a structure that shows the process of creation in a way that completed forms cannot, preserving the steps that led to its near completion. Stone-shaped but not lifted, a form defined but not placed, a structure that remains where it began. And that stillness, the weathered stone arcs carved into the rock city, obelisk, along a stretch of exposed rock where the surface feels shaped both by human effort and long-term erosion. There are forms that don't immediately reveal how they were created. At first, the landscape looks continuous, stone rising from the ground, layers worn by time, open surfaces without clear boundaries. But then, the curves begin to appear, openings shaped into arcs, edges softened but still defined, spaces carved into the rock rather than built upon it. And slowly the surface becomes something else. This is obelisk. And what makes it stand out is not just that it is carved into stone, but how its structures form arcs and curved openings, because these shapes create spaces that feel both natural and constructed at the same time, and that changes how the site is understood. The arcs are cut directly into the rock, not assembled from separate pieces, but shaped from a single mass, creating openings that define entry and space within the structure. And that method matters, because it shows removal rather than construction. The curves of the arcs are smooth, rounded, maintained even after long periods of exposure, indicating that the shaping was controlled rather than incidental, and that smoothness reflects precision, because it shows that the form was deliberate. The weathering of the stone has altered the surfaces, edges softened, textures worn, creating a balance between the original shape and the effects of time. And that transformation adds depth, because it shows change. The arcs connect to interior spaces, leading into chambers carved within the rock, creating a system where exterior openings transition into enclosed areas. And that connection adds structure, because it links space. The placement of these arcs across the site is not uniform, some positioned higher, others lower, creating variation that reflects adaptation to the rock's natural form. And that variation matters, because it shows that the design responds to the material. The effort required to carve such forms would have been significant. Stone removed gradually, shapes refined over time to maintain consistent curvature, a process that requires both control and planning. And that effort reflects intention, because it shows that the structure was shaped. The thickness of the rock around the arcs creates stability, because the surrounding material supports the openings, allowing them to remain intact despite exposure, and that stability keeps the structure present. The interaction between light and the arcs defines how they are seen, because shadows form within the curved openings, creating depth that changes throughout the day. And that interaction adds another layer, because it shapes perception. The purpose of these arcs is not fully defined, because while they clearly create access and define space, the full range of their use within the site remains uncertain. And that uncertainty adds mystery, because it leaves interpretation open. The relationship between the carved forms and the natural rock creates contrast, because one reflects intentional shaping, while the other retains its original state. And that contrast adds impact, because it highlights the difference. The scale of the arcs varies, some large enough to pass through easily, others smaller, creating diversity in how the spaces are accessed and experienced. And that variation adds complexity, because it shows that the design is not repetitive. The durability of the rock allows these structures to remain, Despite erosion and exposure, the arcs still hold their shape, preserving the form even as the surface changes, and that persistence keeps them relevant. The alignment of the arcs suggests organisation, not random placement, but positioning that creates flow through the site, guiding movement from one space to another, and that flow reflects design, because it shows that the layout was planned. Even now the arcs remain, weathered but defined, their curves still visible, their spaces still accessible, allowing the structure to be understood through its form, and that presence keeps it alive. What defines obelisk is transformation, not just carving, but time. A structure shaped by human effort, then reshaped by exposure, a form that exists between intention and erosion. And that creates something different, because it is not static, it changes. Curves softened by weather, spaces preserved within stone, a structure that continues to evolve. And maybe that is what makes the stone arcs of obelisk stand out, not just because they were carved, but because they endured. A structure that holds its form even as its surface shifts, maintaining its identity through change. Stone shaped into curves, openings leading into depth, a balance between structure and erosion. And that transformation, the pyramid that disappeared beneath sand and slowly returned, Sudan. In a landscape where the ground is constantly shifting, where wind moves across open space and reshapes the surface over time, there are structures that do not remain fully visible. They rise, they vanish, and sometimes they return. At first the desert feels uninterrupted, sand stretching in every direction, no clear edges, no fixed forms. But then, something begins to break the pattern. A slope that feels too straight, a line that holds its direction, an angle that doesn't belong to wind, and slowly the shape reveals itself. This is one of the pyramids of Sudan. And what makes it stand out is not just its form, but the fact that it was once buried beneath layers of sand, because this structure did not collapse or disappear, it was covered, and that changes how the site is understood. The pyramid is geometric, defined by straight edges that meet at angles, forming a structure that contrasts with the soft, shifting surface around it. And that geometry matters, because it resists change. The sand that covered the pyramid accumulated gradually, layer by layer, driven by wind, settling into place until the structure was no longer visible from the surface. And that process reflects transformation, because it shows how landscapes evolve. The exposure of the pyramid is also gradual, sand shifting away, revealing sections of the structure over time, creating a partial view before the full form becomes clear. And that emergence adds depth, because it connects past and present. The surface of the pyramid is built from stone, blocks placed to create stable faces that hold their shape even when buried, allowing the structure to remain intact beneath the sand. And that stability reflects understanding, because it shows that the construction was durable. The angles of the pyramid remain sharp. Even after being covered, the edges continue to define the structure, creating a form that is recognizable once revealed. And that precision matters, because it preserves identity. The effort required to build such a pyramid would have been significant. Stone gathered, transported, placed in alignment to create a form that could withstand both time and environmental change. And that effort reflects planning, because it shows that the structure was intentional. The relationship between the pyramid and the desert creates contrast, because one is fixed, the other constantly shifting, creating a dynamic interaction where the structure can be hidden and revealed. And that contrast adds meaning, because it highlights difference. The purpose of the pyramid is associated with burial, but the full context of its use and how it connected to the surrounding landscape is not completely preserved, and that uncertainty adds complexity, because it leaves gaps. The scale of the pyramid defines its presence, large enough to dominate when visible, but vulnerable to disappearance when covered, creating a balance between visibility and concealment. And that balance matters, because it shapes perception. The exposure of the pyramid allows its structure to be studied. Faces, edges, surface details becoming visible again after being hidden, revealing aspects that were preserved beneath the sand, and that visibility keeps it relevant. The surrounding landscape does not remain constant, because wind continues to move sand, meaning that the pyramid may be partially covered again over time, and that cycle adds another layer, because it shows that the process is ongoing. Even now, the pyramid remains, partially exposed, its form visible against the desert, its structure intact despite the conditions that once concealed it. And that persistence keeps it present. What defines this pyramid is concealment, not destruction, but burial, a structure that was covered, then revealed, a form that exists between visibility and absence, and that creates something different, because it is not static. It changes with the landscape, appearing, disappearing, holding its shape even when unseen, and maybe that is what makes the buried pyramid of Sudan stand out, not just because it was built, but because it endured being hidden, a structure that remained intact beneath layers of sand waiting to be revealed again. Stone beneath shifting ground, edges emerging from dust, a form returning to view, and that cycle. A structured grid hidden beneath the open field, Carahantepe. Across a landscape that appears open and unchanged, where the ground stretches without interruption, and nothing immediately suggests complexity, there are patterns that exist just beneath the surface. At first the field feels ordinary, flat, quiet, continuous. No walls, no visible structures, but below that surface, the layout changes. Lines, intersections, spaces that follow a pattern rather than randomness. This is Carahantepe. And what makes it stand out is not just the presence of buried structures, but the suggestion of a grid beneath the field, because the arrangement of subsurface elements forms a pattern that repeats across the site, and that changes how the landscape is understood. The grid is not visible in full, it exists beneath the ground, revealed only through partial exposure, creating a structure that is defined more by inference than direct observation. And that concealment matters, because it shapes discovery. The lines of the grid suggest alignment, straight paths intersecting at angles, forming a layout that follows consistent spacing rather than irregular distribution. And that alignment reflects planning, because it shows that the structure was organized. The subsurface elements are composed of stone, placed or carved in ways that create boundaries, defining spaces that extend beyond what can be seen on the surface. And that composition adds depth, because it shows that the structure exists below. The intersections within the grid create nodes, points where multiple lines meet, forming connections that suggest movement or division of space within the system, and that connectivity adds complexity, because it shows that the layout is integrated. The effort required to create such a grid would have been significant. Ground opened, stone placed or shaped, alignment maintained across distance to ensure that the pattern remains consistent, and that effort reflects precision, because it shows that the design was followed. The surface above the grid does not fully reveal what lies beneath, because soil and time have covered the structure, creating a layer that hides the pattern while preserving it. And that contrast adds mystery, because it separates appearance from reality. The spacing between elements suggests repetition, not identical units, but consistent intervals that create rhythm across the structure, and that repetition reflects design, because it shows that the layout follows a rule. The purpose of this grid is not fully defined, because while its structure is evident, the reason for creating such a patterned system beneath the ground remains uncertain, and that uncertainty adds depth, because it leaves interpretation open. The relationship between the grid and the surrounding field creates contrast, an organized structure beneath an unstructured surface, showing how complexity can exist without visibility. And that contrast adds impact, because it reveals hidden order. The durability of the stone ensures that the grid remains. Even as the surface changes, the underlying structure holds its form, preserving the pattern over time, and that persistence keeps it relevant. The visibility of the grid depends on exposure. Sections revealed through excavation or natural processes provide glimpses into the system, but much of it remains hidden. And that limitation adds another layer, because it expands the unknown. The scale of the grid becomes clearer when considered as a whole, because individual segments may seem simple, but their connections form a system that extends across the field, and that scale matters, because it defines the structure. Even now the grid remains, hidden beneath the ground, its lines still aligned, its intersections still defined, allowing the system to exist even without full visibility. And that presence keeps it alive. What defines this site is structure, not visible, but present. a pattern beneath the surface, a system formed by alignment, a design that exists without being fully seen, and that creates something different, because it is not revealed all at once, it is uncovered, piece by piece, line by line, a grid that continues beneath the field, and maybe that is what makes Carahantepe stand out. Not just because of what is visible, but because of what lies beneath, a structure that holds its form in silence, waiting to be understood through fragments, stone arranged in pattern, lines crossing below ground, a system hidden in plain sight, and that structure, the massive stone reservoir built to hold what is no longer there, Timgad. In a landscape where dryness defines the surface and water feels distant, there are structures that suggest a very different condition once existed. At first, the ground appears open. Dust, stone, wide spaces without movement. But then, the shapes begin to emerge, rectangular forms, sunken spaces, boundaries carved into the land, and suddenly, the emptiness feels intentional. This is Timgad, and what makes it stand out is not just the presence of large stone reservoirs, but how they are constructed with precision, because these are not natural depressions, but engineered spaces designed to collect and hold water, and that changes how the site is understood. The reservoirs are deep, cut into the ground, creating enclosed spaces that descend below the surface, forming containers defined by stone walls, and that depth matters, because it defines capacity. The walls are built from stone, straight, layered, designed to hold pressure, indicating that the structure was meant to contain a significant volume. And that strength reflects understanding, because it shows that the builders accounted for weight. The shape of the reservoirs is geometric, often rectangular, defined by clean edges that separate them from the surrounding terrain, creating a contrast between natural ground and constructed space. And that geometry adds clarity, because it shows design. The interior surfaces are smooth in places, finished to reduce leakage and maintain the integrity of the stored water, suggesting that function guided the construction. And that finish reflects purpose, because it shows that the structure was meant to hold. The scale of these reservoirs is large, not minor storage, but systems capable of supporting sustained use, indicating that they were part of a broader network rather than isolated features. And that scale adds significance, because it shows importance. The effort required to construct such reservoirs would have been considerable. Stone cut, placed, ground excavated to form deep, stable chambers, a process that requires coordination and planning, and that effort reflects organisation, because it shows that the system was deliberate. The placement of the reservoirs within the site suggests integration, positioned in relation to other structures, indicating that they were part of a larger system that managed resources, and that placement adds meaning, because it shows connection. The absence of water today creates contrast, because the structures remain, but their function is no longer active, leaving empty spaces where movement once existed. And that contrast adds depth, because it highlights change. The durability of the stone ensures that the reservoirs remain intact. Even without water, the structures hold their form, allowing their design to be understood clearly, and that persistence keeps them relevant. The edges of the reservoirs create boundaries, clear separations between interior and exterior, forming defined spaces within an otherwise open landscape, and that boundary adds structure, because it organises space. The purpose of these reservoirs is understood in function, but the full scale of their use, and how they connected within a larger system, is not completely preserved, and that uncertainty adds complexity, because it leaves gaps. The relationship between the reservoirs and the surrounding environment suggests dependence, because their existence implies that water was once present or directed to them, indicating a system that interacted with natural resources, and that relationship adds context, because it connects structure and environment. The repetition of these reservoirs across the site creates a pattern, multiple units forming a network, indicating that the system was designed for reliability and distribution, and that repetition reflects planning, because it shows that the design was scaled. Even now, the reservoirs remain, empty, but defined, their walls still standing, their depth still visible, allowing the structures to be understood through their form, and that presence keeps them alive. What defines these reservoirs is capacity, not decoration, but function. spaces built to hold, structures designed to contain, a system created to manage something essential, and that creates something different, because it is not symbolic, it is practical. Stone shaping volume, depth defining space, a system built around containment. And maybe that is what makes the reservoirs of Timgad stand out. Not just because they exist, but because of what they once held, a structure that remains even when its purpose has faded from the landscape. Empty chambers beneath the ground, walls built to resist pressure, a system that once carried life, and that absence, the massive stone that was cut but never moved, Shan. At the edge of a quarry where stone was once removed with precision and purpose, there is a block that stands apart from everything else. Not because it was finished, not because it was placed, but because it remains exactly where it was cut. From a distance, it looks like part of the rock, connected, unseparated, but the closer you look, the boundaries become clear, edges defined, surfaces shaped, a form that was meant to become something else. This is the Shan stone, and what makes it stand out is not just its size, but the fact that it was partially cut from the mountain and left behind, because this is not a natural formation. It is an unfinished structure that never completed its journey, and that changes how the site is understood. The stone is enormous, extending across a scale that is difficult to measure without comparison, creating a presence that dominates the quarry, and that scale matters, because it defines the challenge. The surfaces of the stone are cut, flat in places, marked by lines that show where separation was intended, indicating that the block was being shaped for removal, and that shaping reflects intention, because it shows that the process had begun. The boundaries between the stone and the surrounding rock are visible, sections where material was removed to isolate the block, creating a form that is partially separated but still attached, and that partial separation matters, because it shows that the process stopped. The estimated weight of the stone is immense, far beyond what could be easily moved, creating a situation where the scale of the object exceeds the practical limits of transport. And that imbalance adds complexity, because it raises questions. The effort required to cut such a stone would have been significant. Tools used to shape the surface, labour applied over time to define the block, a process that requires coordination and planning, and that effort reflects ambition, because it shows that the goal was large. The quarry itself provides context, a place where stone was extracted regularly, indicating that the process of cutting was understood, even if this particular block exceeded those limits, and that context adds meaning, because it shows that the attempt was not isolated. The reason the stone was not moved is not fully documented, because while its size suggests difficulty, the exact point at which the process was abandoned is not clearly recorded, and that uncertainty adds depth, because it leaves the story incomplete. The contrast between intention and outcome defines the site, because the stone was meant to be transported but remains in place, creating a structure that represents both effort and limitation, and that contrast adds impact, because it highlights the difference. The surface of the stone retains marks of work, lines and textures that indicate shaping, preserving evidence of the process even though the result was never achieved, and that preservation keeps it relevant. The surrounding rock shows where material was removed, gaps that outline the intended shape, providing a clear view of how the block was defined within the mountain, and that visibility adds clarity, because it reveals the process. The scale of the stone creates perspective, because standing near it changes the sense of size, making the object feel even larger when compared to human scale. And that perspective matters, because it emphasizes magnitude. The purpose of the stone is connected to construction, but its final role was never realized, leaving it as a fragment of a larger plan that was not completed. And that incompleteness adds another layer, because it shows interruption. Even now the stone remains, partially cut, still attached in places, its form visible, its process unfinished, allowing it to be understood as both a structure and an attempt. And that presence keeps it alive. What defines this stone is scale, not just size, but ambition. A block cut from the earth, shaped with purpose, left behind because the next step could not be completed. And that creates something different, because it is not a finished structure. It is a moment frozen in process, a plan interrupted, a structure that never moved, and maybe that is what makes the Yangshan stone stand out. Not just because of what it is, but because of what it represents, a point where intention met limitation, where effort reached its boundary. Stone-shaped but not transported. A structure defined but not completed. A presence that remains where it began. And that stillness. The carved grid hidden beneath the desert surface, Valley of Fire. In a desert where the surface is defined by colour and erosion, where rock formations rise in sharp shapes, and the ground feels shaped by natural forces, there are patterns that don't fully belong to that process. At first, the terrain looks irregular. Waves of stone, layers shaped by time, surfaces that feel uneven and unpredictable. But then, the lines begin to appear, straight, intersecting, forming angles that repeat. And that's where the difference becomes clear. This is the Valley of Fire, and what makes it stand out is not just its landscape, but the presence of a carved grid beneath the surface, because these patterns do not follow natural erosion, but instead form a system of intersecting lines that create a structured layout within the stone. And that changes how the site is understood. The grid is composed of straight lines, cut into the rock, running across the surface and beneath it, forming intersections that create a pattern of repeated shapes, and that precision matters, because it shows intention. The angles between the lines are consistent, not random, suggesting that the layout follows a defined geometry rather than forming naturally, and that consistency reflects planning, because it shows that the pattern was designed. The depth of the carvings varies, some lines shallow, others more pronounced, creating a layered effect that adds dimension to the grid, and that variation adds complexity, because it shows that the carving is not uniform. The surface of the rock interacts with the grid, because natural textures remain visible between the carved lines, creating a contrast between the original formation and the altered pattern. And that contrast adds meaning, because it shows where the change occurs. The grid extends beyond a single area, covering sections of the landscape in a way that suggests continuity, indicating that the pattern is part of a larger system rather than an isolated feature. And that extension matters, because it shows scale. The effort required to create such a grid would have been significant. Stone carved carefully, lines maintained across distance, a process that requires precision to ensure that the intersections remain consistent. And that effort reflects control, because it shows that the design was followed. The alignment of the grid suggests orientation, because the lines run in directions that may connect with features of the landscape, indicating that the pattern was positioned deliberately, and that alignment adds depth, because it suggests connection. The purpose of the grid is not fully defined, because while the pattern is visible, the reason for creating such a structured layout within natural rock remains uncertain, and that uncertainty adds mystery, because it leaves room for interpretation. The relationship between the grid and the surrounding terrain is subtle, because the pattern does not dominate the landscape but exists within it, creating a hidden layer that becomes visible only upon closer observation, and that subtlety adds impact, because it shows how structure can exist without immediate visibility. The perspective from which the grid is viewed affects its clarity, because from certain angles the lines become more visible, while from others they blend into the rock, and that difference matters, because it changes perception. Even now the grid remains, its lines still visible, its intersections still defined, allowing the pattern to be observed despite the passage of time, and that persistence keeps it relevant. What defines this site is geometry, not built upward, not placed on the surface, but carved into it, a pattern that exists within the rock, a system of lines that create structure without adding material. And that approach creates something different, because it reveals design within natural form, straight lines across uneven stone, intersections forming order, a grid hidden within the landscape, and maybe that is what makes the Valley of Fire grid stand out. Not just because it exists, but because of how it appears, a structure that is not immediately visible, but becomes clear once the pattern is recognized. Stone shaped into lines, angles forming structure, a design carved into the earth, and that pattern. The hidden megaliths scattered across the open steppe, Altai. Across a landscape that feels almost endless, where the horizon stretches without interruption and the ground rolls gently in every direction, there are stones that don't belong to the randomness of nature. They don't form mountains, they don't follow erosion, they stand, alone, or in groups, placed rather than scattered, and once you notice them, you start seeing them everywhere. This is the Altai steppe, and what makes it stand out is not just the presence of these megaliths, but how they are distributed across such a vast area, because instead of forming a single site, they appear in clusters and alignments that extend across the landscape, and that changes everything. The stones are large, not uniform, each one different in shape and size, yet positioned in a way that suggests placement rather than chance, and that placement matters, because it shows intention. Some stand upright, vertical against the open horizon, creating silhouettes that are visible from a distance, marking points across the land. Others lie flat, embedded partially into the ground, suggesting that not all were meant to be seen in the same way. And that variation adds depth, because it shows that the system is not uniform. The spacing between these stones is not random. There are patterns, distances that repeat, alignments that begin to form when viewed across the landscape, and that alignment reflects design, because it shows that the placement follows a structure. The steppe itself plays a role, open, unobstructed, allowing these stones to be visible across long distances, creating connections between them that would not exist in a more crowded environment. And that openness adds meaning, because it allows the system to function visually. The effort required to position such stones would have been significant, not just lifting, but transporting, moving heavy material across open ground, then placing it in positions that maintain alignment and stability, and that effort reflects planning, because it shows that the work was sustained. Some of the stones appear to mark positions, points that define space across the steppe, creating a network rather than a single structure. And that network adds complexity, because it extends beyond one location. The ground around certain stones shows subtle changes, raised areas, slight depressions, indicating that the placement of these stones may be connected to features that are not immediately visible, and that connection adds another layer, because it suggests that the system includes more than what is seen. The orientation of some stones suggests direction, facing specific points, aligned along lines that stretch across the landscape, indicating that their positioning was not arbitrary. And that orientation reflects awareness, because it shows that the builders understood space. The purpose of these megaliths is not fully defined, because while their presence is clear, their exact role within the landscape remains uncertain, and that uncertainty adds depth, because it leaves room for interpretation. The scale of the steppe changes perception, because the stones do not dominate the land, they exist within it, becoming part of a larger system that only becomes visible when distance is considered. And that scale matters, because it shapes understanding. The relationship between individual stones suggests connection, not isolated markers, but elements of a broader layout, forming lines, clusters and patterns that extend beyond a single point. And that relationship reflects organization, because it shows that the system is structured. The passage of time has not erased these stones, because their weight and placement allow them to remain, even as the landscape around them changes, and that persistence keeps them relevant. Some stones appear weathered more than others, indicating that they may have been exposed differently, or placed at different times, suggesting that the system developed over time rather than appearing all at once, and that development adds complexity, because it shows that the structure evolved. The absence of clear boundaries makes the site difficult to define, because there is no single edge, no enclosed area, just a spread of stones across open land, and that lack of boundary adds mystery, because it removes limits. The interaction between the stones and the sky is constant, because the open landscape allows the horizon to remain visible, creating a relationship between the vertical stones and the space above them, and that interaction adds another dimension, because it connects the structure to its environment. Even now the megaliths remain, standing across the steppe, their positions unchanged, allowing the patterns to still be observed, even if not fully understood, and that persistence keeps them present. What defines the Altai megaliths is scale, not of the stones themselves, but of the system they form, a network spread across distance, a structure without walls, a design that exists across open space, and that creates something different, because it is not contained, it is extended, stones marking positions, lines forming across land, a system that only becomes visible when the landscape is viewed as a whole. And maybe that is what makes these megaliths stand out. Not just because they exist, but because of how they are placed. A structure that does not rely on enclosure or height, but on distribution, forming a network that stretches across the steppe, a landscape marked by stone, a pattern spread across distance, a system without clear limits. And that design, the giant stone glyphs hidden across the desert, Caracum. Across a desert that stretches without clear boundaries, where the surface appears uniform and unchanged, there are markings that only begin to make sense when seen from a distance. From ground level, the terrain feels empty. Sand, stone, subtle variations that don't immediately stand out. But when the view shifts, the pattern begins to appear. Lines, shapes, arrangements that extend far beyond a single point. This is the Caracum Desert. And what makes it stand out is not just its scale, but the presence of large stone glyphs spread across its surface, because these are not natural formations, but arrangements of stones placed in patterns that create visible designs across the land, and that changes how the landscape is understood. The glyphs are large, extending across wide areas, forming shapes that are only fully visible when viewed from above or from a distance, indicating that their scale was intentional, and that scale matters, because it defines perspective. The stones used to create these glyphs are not carved into the ground. They are placed on the surface, arranged to form lines and shapes that contrast with the surrounding terrain. And that placement reflects method, because it shows that the design was built outward. The patterns vary, some forming straight lines, others creating geometric shapes, indicating that the glyphs follow different designs rather than a single repeated form. And that variation adds complexity, because it shows that the site is not uniform. The arrangement of stones creates contrast, because the colour and texture of the stones differ slightly from the surrounding surface, making the patterns visible when viewed from the right angle, and that contrast adds visibility, because it allows the design to be seen. The effort required to create such glyphs would have been significant. Stone gathered, placed carefully to maintain alignment across large distances, a process that requires coordination and planning. And that effort reflects intention, because it shows that the patterns were deliberate. The desert environment preserves these formations, because the lack of vegetation and minimal disturbance allows the stones to remain in place over long periods. And that preservation matters, because it keeps the designs intact. The alignment of some glyphs suggests orientation, not random placement, but positioning that may connect with features of the landscape or other reference points. And that alignment adds meaning, because it suggests connection. The purpose of these glyphs is not fully defined, because while their presence is clear, the reason for creating patterns at such a scale remains uncertain. And that uncertainty adds depth, because it leaves room for interpretation. The relationship between the glyphs and the surrounding terrain is subtle, because the patterns do not alter the land significantly, but sit upon it, creating designs that are visible without reshaping the environment, and that subtlety adds impact, because it shows that minimal changes can create large effects. The visibility of the glyphs depends on perspective, because from ground level they may appear as scattered stones, but from above they form clear patterns, and that difference matters, because it shows how perception changes understanding. The scale of the glyphs suggests that they were meant to be seen from a distance, not just experienced up close, but observed as complete forms, and that intention adds complexity, because it raises questions about viewpoint. Even now, the glyphs remain, their patterns still visible, their stones still in place, allowing the designs to be observed despite the passage of time, and that persistence keeps them relevant. What defines these glyphs is scale, not height, but spread, a design that extends across the land, a pattern that only becomes clear when distance is introduced, a structure that is not built upward, but outward. And that approach creates something different, because it changes how space is used. Lines formed across sand, shapes defined by placement, a landscape that holds patterns within it. And maybe that is what makes the Caracum glyphs stand out. Not just because they exist, but because of how they are seen, a design that depends on perspective, revealing itself only when distance allows the full pattern to appear. Stone placed across the desert, lines forming shapes, a pattern hidden in plain sight, and that design, the dark stone terraces hidden along the hills, Vancia, along a series of rolling hills where the land rises and falls in long quiet slopes, there are structures that don't immediately stand out from a distance. At first, the terrain feels natural, green, layered, shaped by elevation. But as you move closer, the lines begin to appear, edges that are too straight, surfaces that feel levelled, stone placed where the land would not naturally form it, and slowly, the hillside changes. This is Vancia, and what makes it stand out is not just the presence of stone terraces, but how they are built using darker stones that contrast with the surrounding landscape, creating a system that blends into the hills while still defining them. And that changes how the site is understood. The terraces follow the slope, layered steps carved and constructed into the hillside, forming levels that move upward with the land rather than cutting across it. And that alignment matters, because it shows adaptation. The stones used are darker in tone, standing out subtly against the earth and vegetation, creating lines that become more visible as light changes across the surface. And that contrast adds visibility, because it reveals the structure. Each terrace forms a flat surface, defined by stone boundaries that hold the edge in place, preventing the slope from continuing naturally, creating a controlled level within an uneven landscape. And that control reflects intention, because it shows that the land was shaped. The walls supporting these terraces are built from stacked stone, placed carefully to maintain stability, creating boundaries that hold the weight of the soil and the structure above. And that stability matters, because it keeps the system intact. The spacing between terraces is consistent, creating a rhythm across the hillside where each level mirrors the one below it, forming a pattern that extends across the slope. And that repetition adds structure, because it shows that the design follows a rule. The effort required to build these terraces would have been significant. Stone gathered, carried, positioned along uneven terrain, a process that requires coordination and time, and that effort reflects planning, because it shows that the structure was sustained. The terraces are not isolated, they connect, forming a continuous system that stretches across the hillside, creating a network of levels rather than separate platforms. And that connection adds complexity, because it shows that the site is unified. The darker stones absorb light differently, creating subtle shifts in tone across the terraces, making the structure more visible at certain times of day, while blending into the landscape at others. And that interaction adds depth, because it changes perception. The purpose of these terraces is not fully defined, because while they clearly shape the land, the exact role they served within the broader system remains uncertain, and that uncertainty adds mystery, because it leaves questions unanswered. The relationship between the terraces and the surrounding environment is close, because the structure does not dominate the hillside but becomes part of it, shaping the land while still following its natural form. And that integration reflects awareness, because it shows that the builders worked with the terrain. The elevation of the terraces creates perspective, each level offering a different view of the surrounding landscape, suggesting that the structure was designed with visibility in mind. And that perspective adds function, because it connects the site to its surroundings. The durability of the stone ensures that the terraces remain. Even as vegetation grows and the landscape shifts, the structure holds its form, maintaining the pattern across the hillside, and that persistence keeps it relevant. The pattern formed by these terraces becomes clearer when viewed from a distance, because the repetition of levels creates a visible structure that extends across the slope, revealing the full scale of the system. And that scale matters, because it shows how much of the land is shaped. Even now Vancia remains, its terraces still visible, its stonework still defining the hillside, allowing the structure to be understood through its form. And that presence keeps it alive. What defines these terraces is integration, not separation, but connection. A structure that follows the land, a system that shapes elevation, a design that blends into its environment while still controlling it. And that approach creates something different, because it does not impose itself. It adapts, stone forming boundaries, levels shaping the slope, a pattern repeating across the hillside, and maybe that is what makes the Vancia terraces stand out, not just because they exist, but because of how they are built, a structure that transforms uneven land into a series of controlled levels, creating order without removing the natural form, dark stone against green slopes, lines forming across elevation, a system that rises with the land, and that design, the sun-dried platform left behind in an empty basin, Lopner. In a region where water once defined the landscape, there is now only dryness, a basin, flat, wide, and silent. The ground carries the memory of what used to be there, but the surface no longer reflects it. No movement, no flow, just layers of dried earth stretching across distance, and within that stillness, something remains, a raised form, subtle at first, but distinct once you see it. This is the Lopner Basin, and what makes it stand out is not just that it has dried over time, but the presence of a sun-dried platform within it, because this structure exists as a defined shape in a place that no longer supports the conditions it may have once relied on, and that changes how the site is understood. The platform is elevated, slightly raised above the surrounding ground, creating a difference in level that separates it from the flat basin, and that elevation matters, because it defines the structure. The surface of the platform is hardened, compacted by time and exposure, forming a solid layer that resists the erosion that affects the surrounding terrain, and that durability reflects transformation. Because it shows how material changes. The edges of the platform are defined, not perfectly sharp, but clear enough to distinguish where the structure begins and ends, creating a boundary within an otherwise continuous surface, and that boundary adds clarity, because it outlines the form. The composition of the platform suggests layering, material deposited and compacted over time, possibly shaped or maintained to preserve its structure, creating a surface that differs from the natural ground. And that layering adds depth, because it shows that the structure developed. The basin itself was once different, because the presence of a dried platform implies that conditions have changed, transforming the environment from one state to another, and that change matters, because it shifts context. The effort required to form such a platform would have depended on both natural processes and human interaction. Material gathered, levelled, allowed to dry and solidify, creating a structure that holds its shape over time, and that combination reflects adaptation, because it shows that the structure interacts with its environment. The placement of the platform within the basin suggests intention, positioned in a location that would have been meaningful when the environment was active, indicating that its purpose was connected to conditions that no longer exist, and that placement adds meaning, because it connects past and present. The surrounding ground is uneven, cracked, textured by dryness, creating a contrast between the platform and the basin, making the structure more visible against the landscape. And that contrast adds visibility, because it reveals the difference. The purpose of the platform is not fully defined, because while its structure is clear, the exact function it served within the changing environment remains uncertain, and that uncertainty adds mystery, because it leaves questions unanswered. The interaction between the platform and the sun is constant, because exposure to heat has shaped its surface, hardening it and preserving its form, creating a structure that is defined by both construction and environment. And that interaction adds another layer, because it shows how time affects material. The scale of the platform is moderate, large enough to stand out, but not so large that it dominates the basin, creating a presence that is defined by difference rather than size, and that balance matters, because it shapes perception. The absence of surrounding structures isolates the platform, because it exists alone within the basin, creating a focal point in an otherwise empty landscape, and that isolation adds emphasis, because it draws attention. Even now, the platform remains, its surface still hardened, its shape still visible, allowing it to be observed despite the environmental changes that have occurred. And that persistence keeps it relevant. The contrast between what the basin was and what it is now defines the site, because the platform represents a connection to a different state of the landscape, preserving a form that no longer matches its surroundings. And that contrast adds depth, because it reveals change. What defines this structure is transformation, not just construction, but survival. A platform formed in one environment, remaining in another, a structure shaped by both intention and time, and that combination creates something different, because it is not just built, it is altered, a surface hardened by exposure, a form preserved by dryness, a structure that remains even as everything around it has changed. And maybe that is what makes the Lopner platform stand out, not just because it exists, but because of what it represents, a structure that carries the imprint of a landscape that no longer exists in the same way, a basin without water, a surface shaped by sun, a platform left behind, and that presence, the fragmented stone path that no longer leads anywhere, Geru. Across a landscape where the ground feels flat and open, there are traces of direction that no longer serve their original purpose. At first, it looks like scattered stone, pieces, fragments, nothing that clearly forms a complete structure. But then, the alignment appears, a line, interrupted, continuing again a short distance away. And slowly, the pattern begins to form. This is Geru. And what makes it stand out is not just the presence of stone remains, but the outline of a causeway that once connected parts of the landscape, because even in its broken state, the direction it once followed can still be traced. And that changes how the site is understood. The causeway is linear, extending across the ground in a path that suggests movement, creating a defined route that once linked one point to another, and that direction matters. Because it shows connection. The stones that form the causeway are placed, not naturally scattered, but arranged to create a surface that differs from the surrounding terrain, indicating that the path was constructed rather than formed, and that placement reflects intention, because it shows that the route was designed. The breaks in the causeway are noticeable, gaps where the line disappears only to reappear further along, creating a fragmented pattern that reveals both presence and absence at the same time, and that fragmentation adds complexity, because it shows that the structure has changed. The width of the path suggests function, wide enough to support movement, possibly of people, materials, or repeated use, indicating that the causeway was not decorative but practical, and that function adds meaning, because it shows that the structure was used. The surface of the stones is worn, smoothed in places, rough in others, suggesting that time and exposure have altered the original texture, and that wear reflects passage, because it shows that the structure has endured. The alignment of the causeway remains consistent. Even where sections are missing, the direction can still be followed, creating a continuous line across the landscape despite interruptions, and that consistency matters because it preserves the path. The effort required to construct such a causeway would have been significant. Stone gathered, placed along a defined route, maintained to ensure that the path remained usable, a process that requires coordination and planning. And that effort reflects organisation, because it shows that the structure was sustained. The surrounding terrain does not naturally form a path like this, because the ground is uneven in subtle ways, making the constructed surface of the causeway distinct from its environment, and that distinction adds clarity, because it highlights the structure. The purpose of the causeway is tied to connection, but the exact points it linked and the reason for its specific route are not fully preserved, and that uncertainty adds depth, because it leaves the story incomplete. The breaks in the structure suggest change, not a single moment of destruction, but gradual alteration, where sections were lost over time, leaving only fragments behind, and that process adds another layer, because it shows how structures evolve. The relationship between the causeway and the surrounding space creates contrast, a defined path within an undefined landscape, making the structure stand out through its direction rather than its size, and that contrast adds impact, because it shapes perception. Even now, the causeway remains, not complete, but traceable, its fragments still marking the route it once followed, allowing the structure to be understood despite its condition, and that persistence keeps it relevant. What defines this site is direction, not height, not enclosure, but movement, a path that once guided passage, a structure that connected space, a line that still exists, even when broken, and that creates something different, because it is not fully present, but not fully gone. A route interrupted, a structure fragmented, a system that can still be followed, and maybe that is what makes the causeway of Geru stand out. not just because it existed, but because it still shows where it went, a structure that continues to define movement even after it has been broken. Stone forming a line, gaps breaking continuity, a path that once connected, and that direction, the frozen structures locked beneath ice and silence, Franz Josef Land. In a region where the landscape is defined by cold rather than movement, there are places where time does not seem to pass in the usual way. No flowing rivers, no shifting soil, just ice, layered, still, endless. And within that stillness, something remains. Shapes beneath the surface, edges that do not belong to ice, forms that suggest structure rather than nature. This is Franz Josef Land. And what makes it stand out is not just its extreme environment, but the presence of structures that appear trapped within ice. Because these formations suggest that something once stood exposed, before being gradually sealed beneath frozen layers, and that changes how the site is understood. The ice acts as a covering, not just resting on the ground, but enclosing it, creating a barrier that preserves what lies beneath while also hiding it, and that preservation matters, because it protects detail. The structures beneath the ice appear defined, straight edges, angular forms, shapes that do not follow the irregular patterns of frozen terrain, indicating that they were constructed rather than naturally formed. And that definition reflects intention, because it shows that these forms were made. The depth of the ice varies, some areas thin enough to reveal outlines, others thick enough to completely conceal what lies below, creating a partial view that leaves much of the structure unseen. And that variation adds mystery, because it limits visibility. The process of entombment is gradual, layer by layer, snow compressing into ice building over time, covering the structures slowly rather than all at once. And that process reflects change, because it shows how the environment transformed. The effort required to build in such a region would have been significant. Materials transported, structures assembled under conditions that are not stable or forgiving, suggesting that the site once existed under different circumstances. And that effort reflects adaptation, because it shows that the builders worked with the environment. The alignment of the structures beneath the ice suggests organisation, not scattered forms, but arranged in ways that indicate layout, creating a system that once existed above ground. And that arrangement adds meaning, because it shows that the site was planned. The surrounding environment is harsh, cold dominating the landscape, limiting activity and movement, creating a space where preservation is possible, but access is difficult. And that isolation adds depth, because it separates the site from interaction. The purpose of these structures is not fully defined, because while their forms suggest habitation or function, the details are obscured by the ice that covers them. And that uncertainty adds complexity, because it leaves gaps. The relationship between ice and structure creates contrast, because one preserves while the other hides, forming a balance between visibility and concealment. And that contrast adds impact, because it shapes perception. The preservation within ice allows surfaces to remain intact, edges sharp, forms stable, indicating that the structures have not been eroded in the same way as those exposed to other environments. And that durability keeps them present. The visibility of the structures depends on conditions, light, angle, thickness of ice, creating moments where the outlines become clearer before fading again beneath frozen layers. And that shifting visibility matters, because it changes understanding. Even now, the structures remain, locked beneath ice, their forms still intact, their layout still partially visible, allowing the site to be observed without being fully revealed. And that persistence keeps it relevant. What defines this site is preservation, not exposure, but concealment. A structure that once existed in the open, now sealed beneath layers, a design that remains even when hidden, and that creates something different, because it is not lost, it is contained, frozen in place, protected and obscured at the same time, a structure that exists between visibility and absence. And maybe that is what makes the ice-entombed formations of Franz Josef Land stand out. Not just because they are hidden, but because of how they are preserved. A site that continues to exist beneath the surface, waiting in a state that does not change easily. Ice layered over structure, forms held in stillness, a landscape that keeps its secrets. and that's silence. The intersecting tunnels hidden beneath the gorge, Blue Nile. Along a deep-cut landscape where the river has carved its way through layers of earth and stone, there are spaces that do not belong to erosion alone. The gorge drops sharply. Walls rise on both sides. Water moves far below. From above it feels natural, shaped by time, but beneath that surface, the structure changes. Lines, passages, connections that do not follow the randomness of the terrain. This is the Blue Nile Gorge. And what makes it stand out is not just its depth, but the presence of a tunnel grid beneath it. Because these passages form intersecting routes that suggest a system rather than isolated voids. And that changes how the site is understood. The tunnels run below the surface, cut into the earth and rock, forming enclosed pathways that move horizontally rather than vertically, creating a network beneath the visible landscape. And that positioning matters, because it defines concealment. The layout of these tunnels suggests a grid, lines intersecting at angles, passages crossing each other to form a structured pattern, indicating that the system follows a design rather than forming randomly, and that pattern reflects planning. Because it shows that the layout was intentional. The walls of the tunnels are defined, not rough voids, but shaped surfaces that maintain consistent boundaries, allowing the passages to remain stable over time, and that stability matters, because it preserves the structure. The intersections between tunnels create nodes, points where movement can change direction, forming a network that connects multiple routes rather than a single path, and that connectivity adds complexity. Because it shows that the system is integrated, the depth of the tunnels varies, some closer to the surface, others extending further below, creating layers within the network that add dimension to the structure. And that variation adds depth, because it shows that the system is not uniform. The effort required to create such tunnels would have been significant. Material removed, passages carved, alignment maintained across distance to ensure that intersections meet correctly. And that effort reflects precision, because it shows that the design was followed. The relationship between the tunnels and the gorge above creates contrast, because the visible landscape appears natural, while the subsurface structure introduces order beneath it. And that contrast adds impact, because it reveals hidden complexity. The purpose of the tunnel grid is not fully defined, because while the structure is clear, the reason for creating such an interconnected system beneath the gorge remains uncertain, and that uncertainty adds mystery, because it leaves questions unanswered. The enclosed nature of the tunnels creates isolation, because once inside, the structure separates itself from the outside environment, forming a space that is defined entirely by its own boundaries. And that isolation adds another layer, because it changes perception. The alignment of the tunnel suggests direction, routes that follow consistent paths, indicating that movement through the system was guided rather than random, and that direction reflects organization. Because it shows that the layout was controlled. The durability of the rock ensures that the tunnels remain. Even as the gorge above continues to change, the subsurface structure holds its form, preserving the network, and that persistence keeps it relevant. The visibility of the tunnels is limited, because much of the system lies hidden beneath the surface, with only portions revealed through natural exposure or observation, and that limitation adds depth, because it expands the unknown. The grid pattern becomes clearer when considered as a whole, because individual passages may seem simple, but their intersections form a system that extends beyond a single route. And that scale matters, because it defines the structure. Even now the tunnels remain, hidden beneath the gorge, their paths still intact, their intersections still defined, allowing the system to exist even without full visibility. And that presence keeps it alive. What defines this site is connection, not isolated spaces, but networks, passages intersecting beneath the land, routes forming a grid, a structure that exists below what can be seen. And that creates something different, because it is not visible at first. It is discovered, lines hidden beneath terrain, paths crossing in silence, a system that continues without being fully revealed. And maybe that is what makes the tunnel grid of the Blue Nile stand out. Not just because it exists, but because of how it is arranged, a structure that forms a network beneath a natural landscape, creating order where none is expected. Tunnels crossing below the surface, intersections forming structure, a grid hidden in stone, and that network, the massive stone wall that appears assembled but may not be, Gaya Shorya. Deep within a region where forests cover the slopes and mountains rise in uneven formations, there is a structure that does not immediately reveal what it is. At first, it feels like part of the terrain: rock, elevation, natural formations shaped over time. But then, the alignment begins to stand out: straight edges, stacked shapes, massive blocks that seem to sit against each other in ways that feel intentional. And slowly the question begins to form. This is Gaya Shorya. And what makes it stand out is not just the size of the stones, but how they appear arranged. Because these formations resemble a wall built from enormous blocks, even though their origin is not fully agreed upon. And that changes how the site is understood. The stones are enormous, not small fragments, but massive blocks that dominate the landscape, creating a structure that feels constructed due to its scale and alignment. And that scale matters, because it defines perception. The shapes of the stones are angular, flat faces, edges that meet at clear lines, creating surfaces that resemble cut stone rather than irregular rock. And that definition adds complexity, because it suggests shaping. The arrangement of these stones forms a pattern: stacked layers, blocks positioned above one another, creating vertical height that resembles a wall rather than scattered rock. And that arrangement reflects structure, because it shows alignment. The height of the formation is significant, rising above the surrounding terrain, creating a presence that stands out even within a mountainous environment. And that height adds impact, because it emphasizes scale. The gaps between the stones are minimal in places, edges meeting closely, creating joints that resemble fitted construction, even though no binding material is visible. And that closeness matters, because it suggests precision. The effort required to move stones of this size would be immense, which raises the question of whether they were placed at all, or whether natural processes created this arrangement. And that uncertainty adds depth, because it challenges interpretation. The surrounding landscape provides context: forested slopes, uneven terrain, making the structured appearance of the formation stand out against a more irregular environment. And that contrast adds meaning, because it highlights difference. The surfaces of the stones show signs of weathering, edges softened, textures altered, indicating that the formation has existed for a long period, regardless of its origin. And that weathering adds another layer, because it reflects time. The alignment of the stones follows a direction, not random distribution, but a continuous line that extends across part of the mountain, forming what appears to be a boundary or barrier. And that direction reflects organization, because it shows continuity. The purpose of the formation is not fully defined, because it is not confirmed whether it is a natural structure, or something shaped or influenced by human activity. And that uncertainty adds mystery, because it leaves the origin unresolved. The scale of the stones challenges expectations, because their size exceeds what is typically associated with known construction methods in such environments, and that scale raises questions, because it suggests limits. The relationship between the stones creates a sense of enclosure. Even without forming a complete structure, the alignment gives the impression of a wall, defining space through its presence, and that impression matters, because it shapes perception. The durability of the rock ensures that the formation remains. Even as the environment changes, the stones continue to hold their position, preserving the structure, and that persistence keeps it relevant. The interaction between light and the stone surfaces creates variation, shadows forming between the blocks, highlighting the edges and making the structure more defined at certain times of day. And that interaction adds depth, because it enhances visibility. Even now, the formation remains, its stones still aligned, its structure still visible, allowing it to be observed and interpreted from multiple perspectives, and that presence keeps it alive. What defines Gaya Shorya is ambiguity, not absence of form, but uncertainty of origin. Structure that looks assembled, a formation that resembles construction, a system that does not confirm how it came to be, and that creates something different, because it exists between explanations, natural or constructed, a wall that may not be a wall, a structure that invites interpretation. And maybe that is what makes the Gaya Shorya megaliths stand out, not just because of their size, but because of how they appear, a formation that challenges the boundary between nature and design, creating a structure that feels intentional even without confirmation. Massive blocks aligned in silence, edges meeting without explanation, a wall that raises questions, and that uncertainty. The massive stone forms that resemble temples in the desert, Hingol Balochistan. In a desert where the landscape feels shaped by wind and erosion, there are formations that don't immediately look like natural terrain. At first, the ground appears uneven, dust, rock, ridges formed over time, but then the shapes begin to organise, layers that resemble walls, edges that appear too structured, forms that rise with a presence that feels intentional. And slowly, the landscape begins to resemble something familiar. This is the Hingol region of Balochistan, and what makes it stand out is not just its desert environment, but the presence of massive stone formations that resemble temple-like structures, because their shapes create the impression of design even though their origin is not fully agreed upon, and that changes how the site is understood. The formations are large, towering above the surrounding terrain, creating a scale that dominates the landscape and draws attention from a distance. And that scale matters, because it defines presence. The surfaces of these formations are layered, strata of stone built over time, creating horizontal lines that resemble constructed levels, even though they may have formed naturally. And that layering adds complexity, because it suggests structure. The shapes of the formations include vertical rises, flat sections, open spaces that resemble entrances or chambers, creating an appearance that feels architectural, and that resemblance adds meaning, because it influences perception. The material composition is consistent, stone shaped by erosion, forming surfaces that vary in texture, with some areas smooth and others rough, indicating different rates of wear. And that variation adds depth, because it shows transformation. The alignment of some formations suggests grouping, clusters that appear connected, forming arrangements that extend across sections of the desert, and that grouping reflects pattern, because it shows that the formations are not isolated. The effort required to create structures of this size would be immense if they were constructed, which raises the question of whether they are natural formations shaped by erosion, or something influenced by human activity, and that uncertainty adds depth, because it challenges interpretation. The desert environment contributes to the formation, wind-shaping surfaces, erosion-defining edges, creating forms that evolve over time rather than remaining fixed, and that interaction adds another layer, because it shows ongoing change. The resemblance to temples comes from proportion, balanced forms, sections that appear stacked or tiered, creating silhouettes that feel familiar to constructed architecture. And that resemblance matters, because it shapes how the formations are perceived. The purpose of these formations, if they are natural, is simply the result of geological processes. But if they are influenced or modified, their function remains unknown. And that ambiguity adds mystery, because it leaves the origin unresolved. The scale of the formations creates perspective. Standing near them changes the sense of size, making the structures feel larger and more imposing than they appear from a distance. And that perspective matters, because it emphasizes magnitude. The contrast between the formations and the surrounding desert enhances visibility, because the structures rise from relatively flat terrain, making them stand out clearly. And that contrast adds impact, because it highlights presence. The durability of the stone ensures that these formations remain. Even as the environment continues to shape them, their core structure persists, preserving their form. And that persistence keeps them relevant. The interaction of light across the formations creates shifting shadows, highlighting edges, defining shapes differently throughout the day, adding variation to how the structures are seen. And that interaction adds depth, because it changes perception. Even now, the formations remain, their shapes still visible, their presence still dominating sections of the desert, allowing them to be observed and interpreted in different ways, and that presence keeps them alive. What defines these formations is resemblance, not confirmed construction, but appearance. Structures that look like temples, forms that suggest design, shapes that create meaning without confirming it. And that creates something different, because it exists between explanation, natural, or constructed, a landscape that imitates architecture, a structure that may not be one, And maybe that is what makes the Hingol megaliths stand out, not just because of their size, but because of how they appear, formations that challenge the boundary between geology and design, creating shapes that feel intentional even when their origin remains uncertain. Stone rising from desert ground, layers forming structure, a landscape that resembles architecture, and that illusion, the massive circular structure hidden beneath the ground, Superhenge. In a landscape that appears quiet and unchanged, where fields stretch without interruption, and nothing suggests large-scale construction, there are patterns that remain hidden just beneath the surface. From above, the land feels simple, flat, open, unmarked, no visible walls, no standing stones, but below, the structure is there, a circle, wide, defined, and far larger than expected. This is what has been called Superhenge, and what makes it stand out is not just its size, but the fact that it exists mostly underground, because this is not a structure that rises into view. It is one that was buried, preserving its form while concealing its presence, and that changes how the site is understood. The layout is circular, a continuous ring that defines the boundary of the structure, creating a form that encloses space within a clearly defined perimeter, and that shape matters, because it creates order. The scale of the circle is immense, extending across a distance that suggests a structure far larger than what would be expected from surface observations alone, and that scale defines presence, even when hidden. The elements that form the circle are substantial, large features positioned at intervals, creating a ring that is not smooth, but composed of repeated units. And that repetition reflects design, because it shows that the structure follows a pattern. The fact that the structure is buried suggests change, because it indicates that the landscape has shifted over time, covering what was once visible. And that transformation adds depth, because it connects past and present. The alignment of the circle suggests intention, not random placement, but positioning that follows a consistent geometry, indicating that the layout was planned with precision. And that alignment reflects understanding, because it shows control. The effort required to create such a structure would have been significant. Ground shaped, materials positioned, a process that requires coordination across a large area to maintain the circular form. And that effort reflects organisation, because it shows that the project was sustained. The interior space of the circle is defined by the boundary, an enclosed area that may have served a function, though its exact purpose is not fully preserved, and that enclosure adds meaning, because it separates space. The relationship between the structure and the surrounding landscape creates contrast, because above ground nothing reveals the scale below, creating a difference between appearance and reality. And that contrast adds impact, because it hides complexity. The visibility of the structure depends on discovery, because without excavation or observation from above, the full extent of the circle remains concealed, and that limitation adds mystery, because it restricts understanding. The repetition of elements along the circle creates rhythm, a pattern that extends around the entire perimeter, forming a continuous structure that maintains consistency, and that rhythm reflects design, because it shows that the layout follows a rule. The purpose of Superhenge is not fully defined, because while its form is clear, the reason for creating such a large circular structure remains uncertain, and that uncertainty adds depth, because it leaves interpretation open. The preservation of the structure beneath the ground allows its form to remain intact, protected from erosion that would affect exposed structures, keeping the layout clear even after long periods, and that preservation keeps it relevant. The scale of the structure becomes more apparent when considered as a whole, because individual elements may seem isolated, but together they form a system that defines space on a much larger level. And that scale matters, because it shapes understanding. Even now the structure remains, hidden beneath the surface, its circular form still intact, its layout still preserved, allowing it to exist even without full visibility. And that presence keeps it alive. What defines this structure is scale, not height, but reach. A circle that extends across the land, a boundary that encloses space, a structure that exists without being seen, and that creates something different. Because it is not immediately visible, it is discovered, a pattern beneath the ground. form preserved in silence, a structure that reveals itself only through fragments. And maybe that is what makes Superhenge stand out, not just because of its size, but because of how it exists, a structure that holds its full form beneath the surface, creating a presence that is real even when unseen, a circle hidden in the earth, a boundary without walls above, a design that remains intact, and that's silence. The structure built to hold rows of human skulls, Aztec skull rack. In a place where the ground once supported structures tied to ritual and display, there are remains that do not resemble typical architecture. Not walls, not dwellings, but a framework, designed to hold something that does not remain easily preserved. At first the site appears fragmented, stone, earth, scattered elements, but then the pattern becomes clear, rows, open spaces between supports, a structure defined not by what stands now, but by what once filled it. This is the Aztec skull rack, and what makes it stand out is not just its form, but its purpose, because this structure was built to display rows of human skulls, creating a system that combines construction with symbolism, and that changes how the site is understood. The framework of the structure is organised, supports placed in alignment, creating horizontal spacing that would allow objects to be arranged in rows, and that alignment matters, because it defines order. The skulls themselves would have been positioned along these supports, pierced, mounted, creating a visual pattern that extended across the structure, forming a display that was both structured and repetitive. And that repetition adds impact, because it creates scale. The materials used for the supporting structure are durable, stone bases, wooden elements that once connected them, forming a system that combined permanence with temporary components. And that combination reflects function, because it shows that the structure was built to hold. The arrangement of the skulls would have created density, multiple rows, layered vertically and horizontally, forming a surface that changed the appearance of the structure entirely, and that density matters, because it defines presence. The effort required to create such a structure would have been significant. Supports constructed, skulls prepared and positioned, a process that required coordination and intent. And that effort reflects organisation, because it shows that the system was deliberate. The purpose of the skull rack is associated with ritual and display, but the full meaning behind its scale and arrangement is not completely preserved, and that uncertainty adds depth, because it leaves interpretation open. The structure is defined as much by absence as by presence, because the skulls themselves do not remain in full, leaving behind only the framework that once supported them. And that absence adds impact, because it suggests what was there. The alignment of the structure creates direction, rows extending across the space, guiding the eye along the pattern, creating a visual flow that emphasizes repetition. And that direction reflects design, because it shows that the layout was planned. The contrast between the structure and the surrounding environment highlights its purpose, because it stands apart from typical architecture, creating a form that is defined by what it holds rather than its own shape. And that contrast adds meaning, because it distinguishes function. The scale of the structure increases its effect, because a larger number of skulls creates a stronger visual presence, transforming the framework into something more than just support. And that scale matters, because it amplifies impact. The durability of the stone elements ensures that the base of the structure remains. Even as organic materials degrade, the foundation preserves the outline of the system, and that persistence keeps it relevant. The arrangement suggests that the structure was not static, because elements could be added or removed over time, creating a system that evolved rather than remaining fixed. And that change adds another layer, because it reflects process. Even now, the remains of the structure allow its form to be understood, not fully intact, but defined enough to reveal how it once functioned, allowing the system to be reconstructed through observation, and that presence keeps it alive. What defines this structure is display, not concealment, but exposure, a framework built to hold, a system designed to present, a structure that transforms objects into a pattern, and that creates something different. Because it is not just architecture, it is arrangement, rows forming surfaces, repetition creating scale, a structure defined by what it contained, And maybe that is what makes the Aztec skull rack stand out, not just because of its purpose, but because of how it was built. A system that turns individual elements into a collective form, creating a structure that exists as both object and display. Supports aligned in rows, spaces filled with form, a structure shaped by what it holds, and that presence, the stone bridge that still holds its shape across the valley, Wales. In a landscape where hills roll into each other and water cuts quietly through the ground, there are structures that don't dominate the land, but connect it. At first, the valley feels continuous. Grass, stone, a path shaped by movement over time, but then a line appears, not drawn, not natural, but built. A crossing point where the land is interrupted and then restored. This is an ancient Welsh bridge, and what makes it stand out is not just its presence, but its purpose, because this structure was built to span a gap, creating a connection where none existed naturally. And that changes how the site is understood. The bridge forms a span, extending from one side of the valley to the other, creating a path that allows movement across what would otherwise be an obstacle. And that span matters, because it defines function. The structure is built from stone, placed in a way that distributes weight across the arch or flat surface, creating stability that allows the bridge to remain intact over time, and that stability reflects understanding, because it shows that the design supports itself. The shape of the bridge follows the terrain, not forcing a straight line, but adapting to the natural rise and fall of the land, creating a structure that fits within the environment, and that adaptation adds meaning, because it shows integration. The surface of the bridge is worn, smoothed in places by a repeated passage, indicating that it was used consistently over time, and that wear reflects movement, because it shows that the structure served a purpose. The edges of the bridge define boundaries, low stone sides or raised edges that guide movement across the span, creating a clear path from one side to the other, and that boundary adds structure, because it organises flow. The effort required to construct such a bridge would have been significant. Stone gathered, positioned carefully to ensure balance, creating a structure that can support weight without collapsing. And that effort reflects planning, because it shows that the structure was intentional. The relationship between the bridge and the water below creates contrast, because the movement of water contrasts with the stillness of the stone, highlighting the function of the structure as a crossing point. And that contrast adds depth, because it defines purpose. The durability of the materials ensures that the bridge remains. Even as the environment changes, the structure holds its form, maintaining its ability to connect the landscape, and that persistence keeps it relevant. The alignment of the bridge suggests direction, a path that leads from one point to another, indicating that the structure is part of a larger network of movement. And that alignment adds meaning, because it connects space. The purpose of the bridge is clear in function, but the full context of its construction, including the reasons for its exact placement, is not completely preserved. And that uncertainty adds complexity, because it leaves gaps. The scale of the bridge is moderate, not overwhelming, but sufficient to create a defined crossing, making it noticeable without dominating the landscape. And that balance matters, because it shapes perception. The interaction of light across the stone creates variation, highlighting textures, defining edges, making the structure more visible at certain times of day, and that interaction adds another layer, because it enhances detail. Even now, the bridge remains, its form still intact, its path still visible, allowing it to function as both a structure and a reminder of connections, and that presence keeps it alive. Beneath the surface of a lake, what defines this bridge is calm and unchanged, not isolation. Structures that do not belong to the water, a structure that spans a gap, from a design that restores continuity, wide, a form that allows movement where none existed. Nothing suggests that anything lies beneath, because it is below the surface. The ground is not empty, stone forming a path, a span across distance, arranged in ways that don't follow natural patterns. And maybe that is what makes the ancient Welsh bridge stand out is not just because it exists, but because of what it does. Stone monoliths, a structure that transforms separation into were not formed in the lake, creating a path that continues even after long periods of changes everything. The stone placed across a divide, rising from the crossing held in place, forms that stand against the flat surface beneath them, and that link indicating that they were positioned deliberately rather than scattered. And that positioning matters, because it shows intention. The shapes of the stones are defined, not random fragments, but structured forms that suggest shaping, indicating that they were worked rather than left as natural formations. And that shaping reflects effort, because it shows that the material was controlled. The arrangement of these monoliths suggests pattern, not a single structure, but multiple elements placed in relation to each other, forming a layout that extends across the submerged area. And that layout adds complexity, because it shows that the site is a system. The water that now covers the site creates a layer of separation, because the structures exist in an environment that was not originally theirs, indicating that the landscape has changed since they were placed. And that transformation matters, because it shifts context. The submersion suggests that the area was once dry land, a space where structures could be built before environmental changes altered the terrain, covering it with water. And that shift adds depth, because it connects the site to time. The effort required to create and position these monoliths would have been significant. Stone gathered, shaped, moved into place, a process that requires coordination and planning, and that effort reflects intention, because it shows that the structures were meant to exist. The visibility of the monoliths beneath the water varies, because light and depth affect how much can be seen, creating an incomplete view that reveals only part of the structure. And that limitation adds mystery, because it leaves gaps. The relationship between the monoliths suggests connection, because their placement creates alignment, forming patterns that extend beyond individual stones, indicating that they are part of a larger design. And that connection reflects organization, because it shows that the site was planned. The materials used are consistent, stone shaped into forms that maintain stability even underwater, indicating that the structures were durable enough to survive environmental change. And that durability reflects understanding, because it shows that the construction was solid. The purpose of these monoliths is not fully defined, because while their presence is clear, their function within the original landscape remains uncertain, and that uncertainty adds depth, because it leaves room for interpretation. The contrast between water and stone defines the site, because the structures exist within an environment that conceals them, creating a difference between what is visible and what is hidden. And that contrast adds impact, because it shows how context changes perception. Even now, the monoliths remain, standing beneath the surface, their forms still intact, allowing them to be observed despite the water that covers them. And that persistence keeps them relevant. What defines this site is submersion, not destruction, but transformation. A landscape that changed, a structure that remained, a system that now exists beneath the water instead of above it. And that shift creates something different, because it is not lost, it is hidden. Stone standing in silence, forms preserved beneath the surface, a structure that still holds its position, even when the environment around it has changed completely. And maybe that is what makes the monoliths of Lake Isul stand out. Not just because they are underwater, but because they were never meant to be. A structure, placed on land, now resting beneath water, a design that still exists, even when its original world does not. And that presence, the silent towers that cast long shadows across the corridor, Wakan. In a narrow stretch of land where mountains rise sharply on both sides, there is a passage that feels shaped not just by geography, but by presence. The ground runs between peaks. Wind moves through the corridor. Light shifts quickly as the sun crosses above, and within that shifting light, vertical forms begin to appear. Not cliffs, not natural pillars, but structures, standing still, casting shadows that stretch across the land. This is the Wakan corridor. And what makes it stand out is not just its location, but the presence of tall, isolated towers placed along the corridor, because these structures do not follow the natural patterns of the mountains, but instead create points that rise deliberately within the landscape. And that changes how the site is understood. The towers are vertical, rising upward from the ground in forms that contrast with the sloped terrain, creating silhouettes that remain visible even at a distance. And that verticality matters, because it defines presence. The materials used are consistent with the region. Stone and earth shaped into structures that blend in colour with the surrounding landscape, allowing them to exist without immediate contrast, and that blending reflects adaptation, because it shows that the builders worked within their environment. The placement of the towers is not random. They appear at intervals, positions that suggest spacing rather than clustering, creating a sequence across the corridor, and that spacing adds structure, because it shows that the layout was considered. The shadows cast by these towers are long, extending across the ground as the sun moves, creating shifting lines that change throughout the day, and that interaction with light adds another layer, because it connects the structures to time. The height of the towers varies, some taller, some lower, creating variation that adds depth to the overall pattern across the corridor. And that variation matters, because it prevents uniformity. The effort required to build such towers in this terrain would have been significant. Materials transported across uneven ground, structures raised in conditions shaped by elevation and weather, and that effort reflects planning, because it shows that the construction was intentional. The positioning of the towers suggests observation, because their elevation and placement provide visibility across the corridor, allowing views of movement along the passage, and that visibility adds function, because it connects the structures to their surroundings. The corridor itself channels movement, creating a natural pathway between mountains, meaning that anything placed within it becomes part of that flow, and that context matters, because it gives the towers relevance. The purpose of these towers is not fully defined, because while their placement suggests roles such as observation or marking, the exact function of each structure remains uncertain, and that uncertainty adds depth, because it leaves interpretation open. The interaction between light and structure defines how the towers are experienced, because as shadows stretch and shift, the towers appear to change their relationship with the land, and that movement adds complexity, because it alters perception. The durability of the materials allows the towers to remain. Despite exposure to wind, temperature changes and time, their forms continue to stand, maintaining their presence within the corridor, and that persistence keeps them relevant. The spacing between towers creates rhythm, a sequence that guides the eye across the landscape, forming a pattern that becomes more noticeable with distance, and that rhythm adds structure, because it connects the elements. Even now the towers remain, their silhouettes still visible, their shadows still moving across the ground, allowing the structures to be observed as part of the landscape, and that presence keeps them alive. What defines these towers is placement, not just height, but position. Structures that rise where the land narrows, forms that align with movement, a system that interacts with light and space, and that creates something different, because it is not enclosed, it is open. Towers marking the corridor, shadows stretching across ground, a pattern shaped by both structure and light, and maybe that is what makes the Wakan towers stand out, not just because they exist, but because of how they interact with their environment. A system that changes throughout the day, defined as much by shadow as by stone. Vertical forms against mountain slopes, light moving across their surfaces, a corridor marked by presence, and that interaction.